Good evening or good morning wherever you are in the world. I'm Sharmila Ganapati and I'm moderating the 10th Google Hangout session of the 5th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 15 award-winning, best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, as well as to help us reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign. We'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out about the Pixel Project. Visit www.thepixelproject.net. We have a very special guest with us today for a live discussion and Q&A session, award-winning fantasy author Fran Wilde. Fran's novels and short stories have been nominated for 3 Nebula Awards and 2 Hugos, and include her Andre Norton and Compton Cook winning debut novel Updraft, its sequels Cloud Brown and Horizon. She writes for publications including The Washington Post, Tor.com, Clark's World, io9.com, and geekmom.com. You can find her on Twitter, Facebook, and at franwild.net. Fran has also generously donated a very special and heartfelt goodie bundle to the stash of author goodies we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. Fran's books and art from the Heart bundle include one-of-a-kind illustrated excerpt from the forthcoming Riverland, 1 set of books, Updraft and Cloudbound, paperback signed, personalization upon request, 1 lighthouse pendant featuring original art by the author, and 1 Riverland postcard. There is only one of this bundle available, perfect for Fran Wilde and fantasy fans looking for something unique and collectible. It's for US donors only, so if you live in the United States, donate to get it now before someone else does. So please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And if you're watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Fran questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Regina, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Fran to answer. And now over to Fran. Welcome to Read for Pixels, Fran.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Pixel Project and everybody working behind the scenes to make this happen, as well as everyone who is answering the phones on the call lines for the Pixel Project, as well as making sure that people know and get the word out across, how many countries did you say? There were a lot of countries. This is a global spanning get the word out project to people that may not know that they have resources and that they have ways out of danger. And I think that that is a unique and amazing service that you all are doing. And I want to thank you for that, because that is a very, very important thing.
Thank you. And Fran, would you like to start your reading session?
Sure. What I thought I'd do is I thought that I would read from Riverland, which is a middle grade book that is coming out in the US. Right now, it's coming out in April of next year from Abrams. And this is a story about 2 sisters who rescue each other from a house that has been magicked to be perfect. And by that, I mean that this story is about 2 young women who are doing everything that they can to survive a very tempestuous, tumultuous house. When I wrote this story, I went through a lot writing it. It's a story very close to my heart, and it is a story that's very difficult to tell. A lot of times when you see domestic violence, especially involving children, portrayed in the media, you see a very specific story and a very simple story that is, one that has a very adult gaze. And I think it's very easy to lose track of the fact that these stories are not simple, and the children involved and the adults involved make multitudes of choices all the time that are predicated on survival. And when kids make choices predicated on survival, there is a lot going on in their heads. One, they're looking for other people like them and seeing how they react. And two, they're trying to please their parents a lot of the time because they're their parents. And it's very, very hard to escape a situation of domestic violence when your parents are the ones that are betraying you. So I wrote Riverland in part to talk about that situation with the hope that I don't know that I had any other hope for this book other than that the person, young or old, who needed to see it would find it on the shelf somewhere and it would help them. So I'm going to read you the first chapter of Riverland, which I have, like everyone was saying, I've illustrated for one person, one buyer, and all of the pages are illustrated, but you can't see it because I'm going to read to you. This is chapter 1, House Magic Rules. Some days, my sister and I could sense trouble coming. Other days, like the weather, it caught us by surprise. Today, from up the hill where the school bus dropped us off, our house looked trouble-free, safe. Mama had been busy. The blue clapboard box with its wooden shutters anchored our cul-de-sac like it had been on Riverland Road forever, which it pretty much had. Mike's small purple bicycle leaned on my larger blue one in the shade of the garage. Our lawn, smooth all the way to the shoreline and carefully cleared of leaves, wrapped the house like arms with hands clasped at the pale concrete driveway. Everything seemed perfect. Better than perfect. The house didn't look magicked at all. But today still felt like trouble. And that's why I wasn't in a rush to go home. If I was lucky, Pendra would invite me over. Her house was closer to our bus stop. I formed the beginning of a wish. If I was honest, it was more of a spell in my mind. A spell that would turn Pendra toward her house, not mine. 2 words. Please, Pen. But Pendra Sarti had other ideas. She was looking down the hill too. We always go to my house, she said, like she'd read my mind. We haven't been to yours since summer. You always have some excuse, and you still have my book. We'll get it, and then we can sit on the dock and work on our science posters until the rain comes. As the bus rolled away from our development, empty now, Pendra adjusted her backpack and ignored my frown. She started down the hill. Spells never worked that well for me, not even in the stories I told my sister. And it had been months since she'd been over. Papa had been trying to buy more of the land around Riverland, which stressed him out. And that shouldn't have mattered, but it did. We had a lot of new rules. The dock, Pendra's favorite place to sit, was just visible behind the house. The old wooden frame was mostly barnacles and cracking planks. Once a dinghy had bobbed beside it. I'd seen the pictures. But now, as river and wind whipped together into meringue-peaked waves, the dock swayed. The leaves on the trees near the house flipped over to their silver sides. Storm's going to be here too fast, I said, hopefully, catching up to her as we neared her house. If it rained, Pendra and I couldn't sit outside. We'd better wait. Your house instead. But Pendra shook her head. Yours. Her elbow poked me in the side, nudging me down the hill. Mine's always a mess. Yours? Your mom waves a hand and cookies appear. My brothers are home and loud, and Mike's not there to bother us. I bristled about Mike. Bothering is what little kids do. I don't mind it. You minded it this morning on the bus. You got so angry. That was low. Mike's big mouth was why Pendra was insisting on going down the hill now. She was just kidding about the house. From where I stood, the beginnings of the late fall sunset hit a second-floor window and reflected off the blue fishing boat. What the locals called the blue fishing float, that's actually really important, what the locals call the witch ball, hanging on the landing, everything in its place. Besides, no one's home. Mama had taken Mike to buy shoes after school, and the house rule was no surprise guests, especially if Mama wasn't home. I reached for excuses. Papa's working hard on the permits for the Lawton farm. Definitely no cookies to be had at the wave of a hand today. Elle, no one's at my house either. What's the difference? Pendra was impossible to refuse when she wanted something, and what she wanted right now was to brainstorm science projects at my house, preferably with cookies, where she could look for magic. Mike said, I knew what Mike had said. She blurted to her friend Calliope that morning on the bus, Mama's doing house magic and I get to help her. I'd kicked the back of her seat and she'd gone quiet. Calliope had shrugged it away with an I bet you don't, and Mike hadn't replied. All better, but Pendra had heard, and she was as interested in magic as anyone. The difference, magic or no, I wanted to say now, is that your house is easy and mine is hard.
Oh, you're done.
Yes.
Oh, that was lovely.
Thank you.
So now we'll start with some of the questions that I have.
Okay.
I'd like to point out one thing that we've observed, that your female characters are resourceful and independent. Some of them are leaders or leaders in the making. And some of them go through really interesting journeys of growth and self-discovery. So why is it important for you to portray female characters this way?
I think that it's important, and this is kind of a pushback against the strong female narrative that is becoming much more popular. It's sort of, the female savior, the Buffy complex, for instance, is because I think that female stories, the heroic arc for women is much different than it is for a heroic arc for a male character is pretty familiar to a lot of people, but I think that the heroic arc for a female character can be so different in so many ways. And a lot of that is realizing that the self that you have been given, the sense of self that you have been given by society, is not necessarily who you truly are. And figuring that out and then going on an adventure or knocking something over or doing stuff that's wrong and figuring that out and remaking yourself from there is all a very female, feminine story. And it is something that isn't just restricted to gender. I want to point that out too. It is very specifically restricted to female identifying characters. And in particular, I think that my characters have, for the most part, been given roles in society that they're expected to do certain things by their parents, by their kingdoms, by technology in some cases in my sci-fi stories. And they look at those things and they take them, at face value because that's what they're given at the beginning of the story. And at some point very early on, they make a decision and they say, no, I want something different. Mm-hmm. And that wanting that difference is what kicks the story off quite often. The Jewel in Her Lapidary is slightly different because those are two young women that were raised in a tradition that was, this is your role in society. You are the youngest daughter and the least powerful. And so we are giving you no information to behave on a political level. And the only reason why they have to start realizing how to deal with politics in the Jewel in Her Lapidary is because everyone else has been slaughtered. And that, I think, is that sense of entering the world without your armor, without any way to protect yourself, and moving forward from there like that is, for me, the most heroic journey.
I see. So in terms of your characters, what really inspires you to write them the way they are?
I hear their voices. Not like I hear their voices, but I hear them arguing with their situations, with people around them. I hear them fighting to be heard. And quite often, especially Kirit, who was the first character in a novel that I published, I heard her fighting with her mother. And quite often, mothers and daughters have very fractious relationships, and it's difficult, especially in modern times, because there's so much expectation for tradition and for what has gone before, and this is how I did things, so you need to do things the same way. But at the same time, everything is changing and everything is moving forward, and to look at your life and to say, no, I want something different, is an act of revolution that hits at the DNA level almost, and that is a really difficult thing to do.
How important is it for you to create distinctive female characters with agency? How do you break the stereotypes in that respect?
I think the same way that you break the stereotypes for male characters, I think it's important to do it for all characters, because really, male characters have been captured in the same sort of amber, that, with apologies to Zelazny, but that you expect a certain behavior from male characters, and thus you expect a certain behavior from female characters. Mm-hmm. And once you break the mold, once you say, no, this character is going to behave as this character might in real life, with all of their backstory and with all of the understanding what they choose to do, suddenly you have a richer narrative, you have a vastly richer world, and you have a better story. It is not, the simple stories are the ones that we've been raised on, and I think that we need new stories that are much more complicated.
Oh, okay. So in terms of just adding on to that, when you say you need more stories that are complicated, right? So yes. What does that mean to you personally?
Personally, it means that it takes a lot more from me to write them. It means that instead of going in and saying, I'm going to write a fun story, it means that I'm going to commit to writing a true story, something that really rings true to me, whether it's a short story or a novel or a novelette. It means stripping away all of the structure and pretense that you sort of start using when you feel like you know what you're doing. So each story that I have really loved working on is something that I didn't know what I was doing at the beginning, and I just took a risk and said, okay, I'm going to try to tell the best story I can. Riverland is absolutely one of those examples, but a lot of the short stories that I have coming out in the next month or two, absolutely the same thing. We talked earlier about how I have a sequel to the novelette The Jewel in Her Lapidary, which is probably coming out next year in the spring, called The Fire Opal Mechanism, which is about librarians and time travel and an opal, obviously, but also a very bad emerald. And I always promised everybody that when I got to the emeralds, just watch out. And that's in part because emeralds are very difficult and very picky, and I don't like them, but with apologies to emeralds. But it is absolutely true that in that story, I knew the arc that I wanted to tell. I thought I did. But when I went in to write it, the characters kept saying, no, we go this way, and we need to go this way. And that has basically been, once you construct a character that has a backbone and has goals and has things that they want and things that they're afraid of losing, and just a story to tell on their own beyond the story that you want to tell, your story becomes much harder to tell, but also much more worthwhile.
Yeah, I agree. I get that feeling from reading your books as well. They're very real, the scenarios and the worlds that you've created. And
give or take the occasional flying carnivorous giant invisible squid.
Yes, that's true. That's true. In terms of your characters, let's talk a little bit more about your female characters.
Sure.
They're generally flawed in some way. All people are, of course. And you have women who are antagonists as well as protagonists. So when writing female characters, do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes to make them likable or relatable?
I think that is something, especially when you're talking about the character who's the narrator, it's hard to read a character that you don't like. And it is a particular art when an author can encourage you to take in a story from somebody that you vehemently disagree with. I admire that very much. It's also something that, you're going on a journey with a narrator, and you need to at least understand them, even if you don't admire their choices along the way. And I think that is kind of a friendship. I'm just sort of thinking of that now as we're talking. And there is an active friendship that a reader forms with a narrator that is, I like you enough to keep reading, even if I don't admire your choices, or I'm fascinated by you and I want to keep reading, even if I don't admire your choices. And we see that a lot in different genres with different types of narrators, and we see that a lot in media as well. But it's fascinating because a lot of the time the unlikable narrator can be a man. It's absolutely possible to be a guy and be an unlikable narrator. And people will buy those books and say, oh, how groundbreaking, how fortuitous that we have this chance to get in the mind of somebody that we don't really like. But you try that with a female character and you do get pushback. You get sort of this, well, how can you possibly present us with this character that we don't like? And that is because I think as women, we have been conditioned to expect ourselves and others to be likable and to make ourselves likable for other people, when in fact there is a whole narrative going on in the background that is a very complicated life, because we're all brains running around in these, in these big containers. And the brains are the same. There is, there are thought processes and amazing things going on in these brains. And I really admire people who can forge friendships and see people for who they truly are beyond the simple story and beyond that sort of, do I like them? Do I not? Does everybody like them? Does everybody not? And there are people out there who will say, you know what? I see something in you. And I'm going forward with that, and I want to hear that story. And quite often, those are the characters that I like to write most, because they have the best stories. And often they have the most amazing adventures.
Yeah, that's true. Do you ever actually get any flack for not making a female character likable enough?
I have not. No, thankfully, I feel like I have so far lucked out in that way. I think that my readers, for the most part, know that I have a T-shirt that says I'm mean to my characters. That is, I put up challenges. I put up things that they need to get over and through and explore further in order to grow. And that's not necessarily, dragons or terrible, horrible things happening to them, especially not certain things, because I'm just not going to, it's played out. But it is a matter of even the emotional hurdles that they have to get over, exploring their prejudices, exploring the fact that, like, here it has to come to terms with the fact that she was raised in a very comfortable bubble, and her best friend, who is the son of her mother's best friend, was raised in a level of austere poverty, and her mom let that happen. She has to really wrap her mind around that.
Yeah.
And that happens through all three novels, where, she comes to terms with the fact that there was a tier system in Updraft, and that she was completely allowed to exist in that way without really realizing what her world was. And here, realizing that happens very late in the third book, because she's been off being a hero. And this is a character who really didn't want to be a hero.
Yeah.
Like, she turns it down so many times. And I think, interestingly enough, I got more pushback over my choice to let her not be a hero than I did anything else. People really wanted to see her go out and kick some more butt. And she's very capable of that, but she was already seeing herself as kind of a pawn for something that was happening, and she refused it. And to actually refuse that role and to want to go and do something else is, I think, something that is very difficult to do. You see people all the time saying, yes, put me on that podium, absolutely, make me, make me the hero and let me lead the charge, when they really shouldn't be doing that. I'm thinking of current events mostly, and people in politics all over the world who may have rushed into accepting a position where they are painted as the perfect hero, when really the story is a bit more complicated.
Right. And also, I've also noticed that, like in books like in Updraft and the Jewel and Her Lapidary, many women seem to have distinct gendered roles to play in society, and at the same time, even the magic or skill a person possesses is gendered. But you have Kirit and Lynn, who seem to defy the conventions and take on roles usually reserved for men. So, what is your inspiration in actually creating stories around women breaking gender norms?
I think there are a couple of background characters especially in the Bone Universe trilogy. There's Aliati, and there are the twins who do also sort of range far and wide over gender norms. And Elna actually plays through a lot of different gender norms. There are also characters in the Bone Universe series. There are, I think, in the initial book, there are 5 or 6 primary characters who have disabilities, and who people don't notice that necessarily because they're very busy living their lives. And I think writing across gender norms is a little bit easier to do when you're writing a secondary world where you can decide what the gender norms are. And especially in a world like Updraft, where flying back and forth between towers is something that both men and women do, and being the best trader is completely dependent on how good a flyer you are and how fast you are and how well made your wings are, and not necessarily on your gender, is really important. So that's one thing. Crossing gender norms also is something that I think the gender norms are set up by certain books and media that we have been familiarizing ourselves with. But if you look beyond that media history, there are so many women that break those gender norms. And there are so many men that break those gender norms. And it's a lot more fluid back there than, than the basic, simple story that media wants you to believe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I think, having said that, I think media influences a lot of our perceptions about gender and how men and women should behave.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, also, like your characters like Kirit, right? She has like mentors and teachers who are men, but like her decision about who to be and what to do is actually sort of her own. She has agency. So was it a conscious choice for you to write her character and her journey like this?
Yes. So Updraft is absolutely a story about Kirit finding her voice. And discovering that, again, some of the things that she's been taught are different than there's 2 different versions of a song, and she has to realize that. But she has to learn how to speak out for herself and how to speak up. And that book is absolutely about her finding that role in society. I'm not sure I answered the question.
Oh, you did actually. You did. You answered it quite well.
Okay.
What is it that about Kirit that is special to you?
It's funny because I think she's the first character that rebelled actively against my very carefully thought out outline for how the story was going to go. That is kind of hard to say because Normally you want a story to flow and you want it to
Yeah.
come out, easily and beautifully and just fall from your fingers onto the page. And Updraft was a very fast write the first time because the major plot was really fast to write. Writing Kira's character, the second time when I went back to revise it, because I tend to write books 3 times. I write them once for sort of the story that I'm telling myself, and I write it again for the story that I'm telling others, and then I write it again for the story that I'm telling the world. And I wish it was different. I wish I could just write it one time and be done with it. But the second time I went back and I was revising, the storyline was going slower and slower. I usually write like 2,000 words a day or 3,000 words a day, and I was down to 500 words a day or 100 words a day, and it was just plodding along. It was miserable. And I said, fine. I am at this point in the book where I don't know really where I want to go now, because obviously this is not, I had characters talking to each other on the page and they were saying like, your plan is bad and this is boring. And, usually that's a good shout out to the author to say, hey, take a look at this and revise it. So I basically gave all my characters the day off and said, you guys go do whatever you want to do. I'm going to write it down and you guys just figure out what you want to do. And about 2/3 of the way through the book is where that happens. And what they came up with for that portion just took off. And all of a sudden I was writing really fast. And the next day I came in and I sat down and I put down 5,000 words. And the day after that, I put down 5,000 words. And it was like, whoa, okay, this is where they wanted to go. And the story had been stalling because Kirit knew, that Kirit was enough of a character to really feel like that didn't feel real for her. But the change that that the character really demanded was much better. And all of a sudden, and so I have this fondness for her, but she's difficult. She isn't super likable. If Kirit wants something, she's going to run through everything else to get it.
Yeah.
She's not necessarily very thoughtful of the safety of other people around her. She learns, obviously, but she's at first she's like, I want to do this. And that's the only thing that's really real to her. And so that's a hard character to write. But at the same time, that I want to do this impulse and just watching that go in a system and in a world that was very much against that sense of individuality and agency was really fascinating.
Right. Oh, that's a really interesting point of view. I mean, on the character and the story itself. Thanks for that. And we've also noticed that you have characters in your books and their storylines featuring violence against women. Yet the male-female relationships between the main characters are generally quite equitable. And the male heroes and supporting characters seem to be respectful of women, their thoughts and decisions. So we noticed that. And I just wonder, do you think reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and toward complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways science fiction fantasy writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Yes, I think that writing. I mean, look, there are so many different kinds of people out in the world, and if you're only portraying one type of hero or one type of way to talk about winning, especially, and that winning is a sense of conquest. If conquest is its reward, then yeah, there are going to be problems down the line with your readers. Your readers are going to maybe take that into account as how to tell a story. I mean, I play a lot of tabletop games. I play a lot of other games. I do a lot of reading. And I know that the stories that you take in are part of what makes you, that gives you an experience in the world. But I also think people make their own choices. And I think that the choice to engage positively in the world and the choice to engage with other people in a way that is that helps things grow and become better is a very personal one. I think portraying characters that do that too is a way to add to the positivity in the world. I think portraying characters that choose not to do that and talking about the consequences of those actions, because that's also something that is lost from the stereotype of, conquest. Let's just talk about that. The thing that's lost from that stereotype is the consequences of those actions. The long-term impact on society, the long-term impact on individuals, their kids, their grandchildren, how people go forward from there after they have experienced violence is something that a lot of stereotypical characters don't really think about once they put that girlfriend in the fridge. And that's something that I think is really important to talk about too.
Just to add on to that, over the years, right? Maybe over the past 5 to 10 years or so, have you noticed a marked change in the way authors portray male or female characters, and in terms of stereotypes?
Yes. I mean, I think look at Tessa Thompson from The Avengers. Like that is so amazing to see this person on screen and just, going for it every minute of every day. She's the one that gets the big gun. She's the one that is like, just wrecking things. And it's wonderful to see. I think that characters across the board, from Rachel Hartman's Tess on the Road, which I absolutely love this book, to characters that are emerging every day from short stories, the short stories in the Unbroken anthology, which is disabled teens, characters that are coming out from retellings of traditional stories that we feel like we've known forever. Madeline Miller's Circe is one. Maria Duhovne Hadley's The Mirror Wife is another. Circe is retelling the myth of the witch who lives on the island and turned all of Odysseus's men into pigs. And to see the story from her perspective is this vivid sort of recapitulation of everything we thought we knew. To see the story of Beowulf, which is a heroic man tale, retold from the position of Grendel's mother is outstanding. And even, it's almost been a year since I read Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. But this is a translation that goes back to the original Greek and pieces it apart without the assistance of all of the traditional English, Alexander Pope translations of the Odyssey, and looks at how the women are described very carefully and talks about the difference between wives and slaves and talks about the politics of Greece. And you realize that it's not so much a democracy unless you are a certain type of person. And that was fascinating. And I think that that's very important. I think that shift is coming like a wave throughout literature. It's coming like a wave throughout politics and media. And I'm looking forward to it continuing.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, speaking of stereotypes and common themes and all, you have in science fiction and fantasy, sometimes the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear. Whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, paranormal romance. Do you think it's an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully? No, in recent years, yeah.
Yes, and I think there's a little bit of weird feedback. I think in particular, there are certain genres that are dealing with consent in all of its forms in amazing ways, and it's worthwhile for everybody to read it. Romance is a genre that navigates consent in extraordinary ways, the YA deals with consent in so many different ways, that, you know, is the examples that are given, the ways that it is explored are extraordinary. I think that science fiction and fantasy are following that trend, but they're absolutely following romance and YA in that sense. And I just have so much admiration for people who cut the trail on this, because they are basically navigating territory and spelling out things that really need to be said.
Okay. Okay. Moving on, adding on to that, you do think that eventually the violent alpha male type character would phase out of science fiction and fantasy as cultures worldwide start kicking out toxic masculinity? Or do you think it's one of those stereotypes that will stick around much longer?
You know, I would like to see a lot less of them.
Mm.
But I think that if you are trying to write books that are true to the world around you, I think the world has a lot of cleaning up to do. And it's not just the job of the fiction writers and readers, although they do play an important role. I think that everybody, and I not just those of us who are active in this world, but I think everybody, including men who see their friends, you know, making jokes, or guys who see, you know, something going on at a bar, everybody needs to step up and say, whoa, no, that's not okay. And that happens across all forms of media as well as in real life.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. We've also, the other thing about stories are they're also the most powerful ways of bringing about change, right? It's what you read that changes you. So in your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about violence against women by telling while telling an engaging story without being preachy?
So we tell stories to explain the unexplainable. Going all the way back to the early myths and legends, we reached out into our imaginations to say, why is fire? Why do we have fire? Why are there mountains? Why was there, you know, this huge earthquake? What happened when this comet passed? We're trying to explain the ineffable to ourselves, and that's how story becomes something that is passed down and that becomes more important to everybody. And I think that explaining the unexplainable, especially when it comes to relationships between genders, relationships between old and young, between parents and children, between men and women, between people of all genders and people of all abilities, it becomes a matter of carefully navigating those relationships and showing actions, showing belief structures, and showing the interior thoughts of everybody involved, and not just the stereotypical hero. And I think that's a way to affect change too.
Also, in your Read for Pixels AMA back in August, you said authors write stories, closely examining the stories they tell and seeing their impacts on readers, finding ways to give voice to those who cannot speak without taking their stories from them. I think those are good potential first steps. So in terms of like your latest book, Riverland, you've got a child who is a survivor of domestic violence. So in relation to that book, your experience from writing that book, do you have any suggestions to authors how they can do this properly without accidentally sensationalizing those who are marginalized?
Yes, and that involves doing your research and talking to people who have actually experienced this. Better yet, encouraging them to tell their stories, not for your own benefit, but for theirs. One of the things that has long troubled me about depictions of domestic violence, especially involving children, is that they are very much cookie cutter depictions where something is being shown on screen that is just the same thing every time. We come to recognize domestic violence involving children because they go to school with a bruise, or they have a broken limb, or something else is wrong. And so we expect domestic violence to look like that. We expect fear to look a certain way in a child's eyes, and we expect the children to behave in a certain type of way. And that comes from everybody who's writing these stories looking at the previous stories about domestic violence and saying, that's how I do this. Nobody's talking to the kids. Nobody's talking to any of the survivors, or if they are, they're hearing what they expect to hear. They're not hearing things that maybe don't fit in their story. So I'm encouraging everybody, if you are writing a story that involves domestic violence, don't just sit down with the media, don't sit down with the familiar, talk to individuals. Everybody's story is going to be different. Everybody's story is going to be entrenched in what they have experienced, not what you are expecting to hear. And I just expect that people going forward to write stories are doing it in particular to help people gain a voice. And if this is not your story to tell, for whatever reason, encourage the person you're talking to write their own story.
Do you find that in general, when it comes to domestic violence, authors of fiction, they don't do enough research, or they don't make the situation real enough in their books?
I think that it depends on the book. That's very hard to generalize. I think that there is a tendency to sort of go to the Law and Order, which is a show in the US that has been running for a long time, that has a very stereotypical way to approach this stuff. Kids are either a pawn that is meant to be saved, or they are, the budding offspring of someone and sort of being groomed to take their place in line with this abuse scenario. And it's really not that simple. So finding resources, talking to school administrators, the privacy laws are very, very strict in order to protect children. And I think that protecting your sources is vastly important. Making sure that you have permission to use the information that you've been given. If somebody trusts you with a piece of data, don't go off and use it in your own story without asking them. That's really uncool. But also just making sure that you are accurately portraying the situation and not just casting more stereotypes upon the situation, because that's just as harmful.
Yeah, that's real, because otherwise people will have wrong perceptions of the whole domestic violence situation. So you're quite right about that.
I talk a little bit about it in terms of there's a drowning metaphor that's going around the US right now that's talking about drowning doesn't look like drowning. There's not this flailing of arms and this kicking and screaming for help. Sometimes people just sink. And we expect drowning to look a certain way because the media has told us this is what drowning looks like. There is this sort of flailing and there's kicking, and it's not. When you're taught to be a lifeguard, you're taught to see that drowning can be a lot of different things, and you have to look for the missing people as well. And in terms of domestic violence doesn't necessarily look like what you would expect. In fact, quite often it doesn't, and that's how people get away with it for so long.
Okay. Next question. Your stories definitely pass the Bechdel test with their depiction of complex and interesting relationships between women. Why do you think many science fiction and fantasy authors still have trouble writing stories that pass this test, despite the fact there are many more things women talk about other than men? And what can you suggest for writers who want to write female conversations realistically?
I think that's changing, actually. And I'm delighted that it's changing. And I think the reason why it's changing is is a much more positive direction to take this, which is, I think that science fiction writers are actually talking to more women and having more conversations with women that don't involve men, and that's showing up in their books, and I'm delighted to see it.
Oh, excellent. And also, how do you think stories that explore the theme that women can be empowered persons in their own right and men should respect women can help stop violence against women?
I think that any narrative that puts forward the fact that women are human beings first, and foremost above everything else, women, children are living, thinking beings that deserve the same amount of respect as everybody else is a valid narrative that will help change the situation, hopefully.
Also, do you think it's important for influential authors such as yourself, who are read all over the world, to make a conscious effort to include characters in your stories that show readers the importance of respecting women as equals and as human beings?
I think if it fits the story, yes. If it doesn't fit the story, if for some reason there is a narrative that doesn't necessarily accept that and it feels false, that will create, like, if you have a character that you are putting in just to give a message across, whatever the message is, it flattens the story out a little bit. I think that the characters evolve from the world and from the setting that you're writing in. So being aware of the characters as human beings, or as beings and thinking beings, even if they're not human, is hugely important, and will do exactly what you're talking about without feeling like you have sort of established a beachhead and you are preaching. Because you talked before, when we were talking earlier, about, how do you tell a story without being preachy about certain things? How do you talk about these things without being preachy? And the fact is, if you are writing a story that at its heart treats every character as a real character, you're going to be able to tell that narrative without being preachy. It's when you start treating certain characters like movable objects or table lamps that suddenly you lose some of that humanity. So every character needs to basically become their own being with their own wants and needs, and be treated with respect. And then you have a valid story that goes forward, that really does advocate for the humanity of everybody involved instead of just the hero.
Yeah, having said that, the thing is about geek culture. It's had its share of critics saying that it's still too male dominated, although you have a rising number of prominent, well-respected, well-known female authors, and there's plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. So, what do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole more welcoming for women and girls?
That's a great question. I have the advantage and the disadvantage of coming up in a bunch of different aspects of geek culture. I was an early adopter of lots of technology. I started programming when I was 8. I wrote my first game when I was 20. I was doing database integration by the time I was 22. I was an engineering writer for a long time. I did a lot of hard science fiction related stuff, and I think that what I saw initially as a student, sort of going into my first computer programming class in high school, I was the only girl in there, and I turned around and walked right out. Because I was like, I don't want to be the only girl in there. That's terrible. And I didn't realize at the time that if I had stayed, the next person to come in the door wouldn't have been the only girl in there. Nowadays, that's very different. There are women all over the world that are fighting for their place, their seat at the table, and they're pushing back against a lot of really entrenched culture. And so, and it's horrible out there. I mean, there are some really terrible things that are going on continually. And there are campaigns to drive women out, professionally, politically, you see it all over the place. And the fact is that women are still fighting back. And they're saying, no, I'm not going to leave this room. And that is huge. On the other hand, I have been fortunate enough to find groups of dominantly women, but not always, who have gathered around different parts of the geek culture and said, this is my place, and these are my people, and this is wonderful. And I feel like I've grown up with them in a lot of ways. And I came to Geek Mom, which is another blogging association. Geek Mom and Geek Dad review different aspects of the culture. And the women at Geek Mom, the mothers at Geek Mom, were fantastic. And it was a fantastic introduction to another level of culture. The fact that they had been writing for years and just delving into all aspects of the culture. A number of them have gone on to work on Critical Role or to develop their own media properties. It's been fascinating to watch everybody sort of come up in the world. So I think that there is a level of possibility available to women moving through geek culture. What I want to see is I want to see it broaden out into much more of a group of women of color who are writing games. I want to see, Black comic book artists. There's this fascinating and amazing comic book shop in Philadelphia called Amaldum that is run. It's the first Black woman-owned comic book store in on the East Coast, at least. And just seeing women come into geek culture and navigate that area and say, no, I'm going to interpret this in my own way. And I'm going to show you how I see the culture. I think that's changing everything, even when there is pushback.
Right. And also, we have to thank you for being really incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign. Thank you for that. And our anti-violence against women work as a whole. Why do you support the cause to end violence against women?
It is a cause that is extremely close to my heart. I think that when half of any population exists in fear, they cannot create, they cannot lead, they cannot contribute in an equal measure to a society. So we're basically weakening our own stance in the universe just by cutting off half of our population, by making women and children afraid. And I think that's ridiculously dumb. It's a bad move evolutionary wise. On an evolutionary scale, weakening half of your population is just dumb.
Yeah, it's just so wrong.
Yes.
And what do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
I think talking about it, talking about their beliefs, I see a lot of authors moving towards making their lead characters female, which I think is great. I think having a much more diverse cast in stories, having stories that talk about a different arc or a different type of thing, making sure that your main character doesn't need to be defined by a past trauma is an amazing way to start the conversation, because not all heroes are born out of trauma. So I think that is important. It's also important to tell stories of trauma and talk about the consequences of those, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the same darn trauma every time. There are lots of things that can form a person's character. Winning is one of them. Finding something that they're really good at an early age is one of them. I think that moving on from the stuff that is tired and overplayed or completely unnecessary really does make a difference.
Yes, I agree. It does make a difference. And before we've come to the end of our Q&A session, and I'd like to ask you if you have any announcements you'd like to make to your readers before we conclude.
Sure. So Riverland, which is what I read from at the beginning of the session, is available for pre-order now. You can absolutely go out, pre-order it. It will be in the mail to you or on your e-reader in April of next year. There'll be much more news around that. I have some short stories coming out, including a short story in the Gem World, which is the Jewel in Her Lapidary. It's coming out in Beneath Ceaseless Skies tomorrow. It is called Ruby Singing, and it is absolutely about violence against women. It's about the power of rumor, and when a town decides whether a person is good or bad, what happens?
I see. Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Fran for attending today and being with us for the session. Thank you very much, Fran.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And I also like to thank everyone for attending and being in the chat today. I will just switch over the screen to myself now to talk a little bit about the campaign and your bundle.
Okay.
So, yeah, just give me a second. Okay, everyone, thank you for attending the session. We'd like to just reiterate that Fran's books and art from the Heart bundle include one-of-a-kind illustrated excerpt from the forthcoming Riverland book, one set of books, updraft and cloudbound, paperback signed, personalization upon request, one lighthouse pendant featuring original art by the author, and one Riverland postcard. There is only one of this bundle available. It's for US donors only, so if you live in the United States, donate to get it now before someone else does. There are also plenty more author goodies available from authors including Lee Bardugo, Susan Dennard, Karen Rose, Elliot de Bodard, Alison Goodman, Jake Christoph, and more. New goodies will be released every week as well as the campaign gets underway. So please give generously to help us reach it. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. So I'm going to share with you a slide. That describes our donation campaign. Just keep. Okay, so you can donate for goodies via Rally Up, and the URL is http://is.gd Read for Pixels Rally Up 2018. And you can find out more about Read for Pixels at http://is.gd/readforpixels. If you want to learn more about our work about the Pixel Project, please go to the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. And once again, to find out about the Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign, please visit http://reveal.thepixelproject.net to learn more about it. And please do donate generously to help us reveal our first celebrity male role model. Thank you and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world.